My story takes place in a town you probably never heard of in southeastern rural Kentucky. It's a small town with its people sparsely peppering the mountainsides to and fro. It's the type of town where it isn't exactly unusual to find neighbors bartering for goods with livestock, living off what the land provides, and making do with what they got. It's here that my father was raised, and it's here that my father raised his family. My father was a proud man, short, barely 5'7", but stout. He was many things: a mountaineer, a carpenter, a survivor, a hunter, but mostly he was proud. He instilled in me all the virtues that I believe in today. He's the type of man that would give you the last dollar to his name, the type that would go hungry to make sure his kids were fed, and there were times that he did. I suppose I should clarify that I grew up in poverty. No doubt there were those that were worse off than me, but times were hard nonetheless. My father worked intermittently, mostly in construction. There were few homes within the community that my father didn't at least help with. He built our house from the ground up, dug out the basement, leveled the land with little more than a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and the helping hands of my uncle and two older brothers. Our house sat on a hillside in a leveled alcove. The yard stretched on for what seemed like forever, ending at a fresh mountain brook where the woodland lied beyond. He spent a lot of time in those woods, hiking trails, digging ginseng, hunting, and otherwise passing the time the way you do there. The mountains provided our family with most necessities. Our water was pumped from a mine near the mountain's peak. Our food consisted mainly of game and livestock. My mama was a wonderful cook. She had a fondness for chicken, which we raised. My father, on the other hand, he preferred game, and he was no stranger to the culinary arts. My father was adept at preparing a variety of dishes, all of which he tracked and killed himself. Long before the sun would rise, my dad would grab his light and head out. He would follow the mountain stream before turning off onto one of the many mine roads that littered the trail. One such road ran by an old graveyard long since forgotten by the rest of the world. Some headstones there dated back to the onset of the 19th century. I recalled one night my father decided to go spotting. For those of you unfamiliar, spotting is a common practice amongst Appalachian hunters. The hunter will set out before sunrise, take a light and little else. The hunter will then proceed to shine the light, much like a spotlight, in hopes of glimpsing of an animal's eyes. Now, you see, the eyes of an animal are luminous, and in complete darkness, when the light passes over them, they will shine. This is a method of establishing good hunting venues. On this particular night, my father broke tradition and decided to take his shotgun with him on his spotting expedition. This decision, I would later learn, saved his life. It was a warm spring night. I was always a night owl, so when my father stirred, I was still awake and playing my Super Nintendo. "Hey, big man," he chimed, "you're up late." I said, "Yeah, I want to beat Super Mario," my eyes leaving the screen long enough to see him tying his boots. He didn't reply. He just smiled and rubbed my head as he passed me on his way to the gun cabinet. And from it, he removed his customary 12-gauge shotgun, some shells, and a miner's light. The light, I recall, strapped to his forehead and attached to a rather large battery that hung at his waist. He then made his way to the couch and sat next to me. When I finished my level, he smiled and said, "Pause it, I need to check the forecast." And I obliged, and he changed the channel, and he watched as the forecaster rambled on about the weather and seemed content. "Not giving rain for today, that's good," he said as he turned and smiled to me again. Okay, you can go back to your game. I'm going out. I'll be back in a while. Tell your mother I'm bringing home supper, and tonight we're going to have rabbit." And he kissed my forehead and he stood up, and I smiled at him as he rounded the hallway corner to our front door. And I listened to the door shut and to the clunk of his boots as he made his way off the porch, down the steps and through the yard, and his steps faded off into the distance. Now, from this point on, I cannot vouch for the validity of this tale, but I can tell you that the man who returned was not the man that left. Make no mistake, my father did come home, but he was changed. He never spoke much of that night until after I'd started college. This is his story. Like most other nights, he headed up the mountain via a trail that ran alongside the brook. The air was still and warm, and the moon and stars shone bright. There were no clouds. The forecast was clear. The sound of cicadas and crickets filled the air. He made his way along the trail, intermittently shining his light on either side of the stream. He walked along the stream until he reached a fork in the path. To his left was his customary turnoff. Further up the trail was an old slate dump. Above it was a derelict coal chute. He shined his light along the trail and contemplated. He'd been talking with his hunting buddies, and they had mentioned a sweet spot near the graveyard. A warren of rabbits had apparently taken residence near the abandoned cemetery, and they had all had good fortune hunting there. My father thought on it for a moment before turning to the right. The right trail led up on the mountain to the mine where we drew our water. It passed by the cemetery where the rabbits were said to reside. He continued to follow the stream until making his way to the cemetery. Upon his arrival, he skimmed his light back and forth across the plots. If there was a warren here, the rabbits were definitely not being very active tonight. He trudged amongst the plots until finally deciding to move on. He walked back to the trail and stopped. He could go back along the stream trail and to the slate dump. At the very least, he thought he could cover grounds he was used to hunting. But instead, he decided to follow the trail further. He'd been walking for a little more than 15 minutes when he noticed something strange happening. The light from the moon and the stars was completely gone. Clouds covered the sky. In the distance somewhere there was a flash of lightning. He counted the seconds to the thunder. The sky roared a moment and then fell silent. There was no rain. He silently observed his surroundings, shining his light on either side of the trail. He paused for a moment longer and then trudged on. As he walked, he noticed something else. Very faint, very rhythmically, his footsteps were echoing. This was unusual. If you've ever been in a wooded mountain, one thing you'll notice is that the mountains are excellent listeners and seldom repeat what they're told. It was then that the silence consumed him. The cicadas, the crickets, the owls, they were all hushed. My father stopped and shined his light around him. He saw nothing. After a moment, he continued along the trail. The echo was silent for a moment, and then it started up again. With every crunch of my father's feet, he said he could hear a crunch simultaneously hit the trail behind him. Someone or something was following him, deliberately and furtively stalking him. He stopped again, and so did his echo. He shined the light around him again, in all directions, down the trail, in the trees, even in the air. Nothing. There was nothing there. He observed his surroundings. He noticed another trail not 3 feet from him on the other side of the brush, and silently he began devising a plan. He decided that he would begin walking again, and when the echo commenced, he'd take another step, but he'd stop. If it was his mind playing tricks, then the echo would stop too. He turned up the trail and continued on his way, and within moments the echo reemerged. He waited until he was confident the time was right, and he stepped and stopped mid-step. His foot was barely an inch from the ground. That sound resonated through his being, sent shivers down his spine. He spun around and shined the light again, only to be greeted by darkness. He turned back up the trail and quickened his pace. This time the strides didn't mimic his. They were faster and louder. It dawned on my father at this point that he'd pissed it off, whatever it was. He took his shotgun and he racked it and developed a plan in his mind. He decided to step through the brush to the trail on the other side, and there he'd wait for it to pass him, and he would turn the tide. Without hesitation, he cut off his light and he stepped across the brush and waited in darkness. And the sound of its strides continued up the trail before stopping what sounded like mere feet away. Then it crossed through the brush, coming to a halt beside him. His stomach sank and he fumbled for his light. He could feel eyes burning into his skin, boring holes into his brain. The light came on with a sudden flash. Nothing. There was absolutely nothing there. He shined the light all around him. There was no sign of anything passing through the brush, no sign of anything walking along the trail. My father, an expert hunter, could find no trace of the thing that was stalking him. He shined his light further up the trail, saw something, a building, the old coal chute that was just above the slate dump. He bolted for it. He could hear its strides coming up fast behind him. He turned into the coal chute and he dove in. The chute collapsed around him, sending him pouring down onto slate and rock. He quickly made his way to his feet and shined his light toward the chute, shotgun in firing position. He could hear it moving fast up the trail. He heard it hit the coal chute. The chute thundered and trembled under its weight, but my father couldn't see anything. He blindly fired, pumped, fired again, and again. The boom of his shotgun echoed throughout the valley, the sound matched by a roar that made the hair on his neck stand. The chute was silent for a moment. Then he heard its strides bolt in the opposite direction. It made its way up the mountain toward the mine. He listened for a long time. Silence. He got home around noon. He was beaten up pretty bad from his fall. He never said a word. My mother attempted to console him, and he silently looked at her, his eyes filled with dread and his ever-present smile just gone. Not long after that, he and my mom, they broke up. I returned home to find him sitting on the porch, shotgun beside him. He'd long since erected a security fence around the property, told me his tale, told me that he continued to hear it. When he walked to his mother's, or when he trimmed the hedges, or he mowed the lawn, he could hear it following him, ever presently. It stalked him, hunted him. After my father passed away, I left the house empty. It didn't feel right taking it when he had built it from the ground up. And then I met the woman who would become my wife. We married after I graduated college, had kids. I brought my family back here to raise them where I was raised. And now, as I write this, I am fearful. Each night, I do a quick sweep of the property. I check the house and then I check the yard. And each night, since we moved in, I can hear my footsteps echoing beyond the fence.